Okay, it's 5:15, so I want to get this going. We have until 6:30, so 75 very good minutes ahead of us. My name is Kanti Bajpai. I'm Vice Dean Research at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I'm also Director of the Center on Asia and Globalization, the remit of which is to look at Asian issues, geopolitical issues, and more broadly political economic issues. Also a welcome on behalf of my center, which has helped organize this evening. We are very happy to welcome Asantha to our midst. I'm not going to, as always, give you a very long introduction. We keep them very short here so that we can give a lot of time to the speaker, and also so that we don't repeat stuff that you're already aware of. But let me say just a few words about him, and then I'm going to ask him to say a few words about his own affiliations in the United States and some of the work he's doing, which may not come across altogether in his talk, but I thought it'd be quite interesting for you to know some of the things that he's doing in DC. So right now he is a senior fellow and executive director of the South Asia Foresight Network, which he said is a new group, relatively new, at the Millennium Project in Washington, D.C. I didn't know what the Millennium Project was. I had a sense that there are all these millennials running around there, but that's not what it is. And he's going to say something about what it is. He's very well known in Sri Lankan circles. That is, anyone who does Sri Lankan affairs within the country or outside knows Asantha and his work. He has held two rather important think tank positions, involved in quite a lot of strategic advocacy in Sri Lanka. The first was, he was founding Director General of the National Security Think Tank under the Ministry of Defense until January 2020. So that's just 3 years ago. And before that, he served as Executive Director at the Kadir Gamar Institute, a very well-known Sri Lankan think tank. He's authored several books. The latest is here, Teardrop Diplomacy, China-Sri Lanka Foray. Very keen to know about the book. I just got back from Dhaka, Bangladesh, and all the talk there was on, much of it on China and China-India. So I think for me personally, I'd be quite keen to know what's going on in Sri Lanka, another South Asian country, in respect of that competition. But he's also the author of Conundrum of an Island and Sri Lanka at Crossroads, published by our own World Scientific here in Singapore. So with that, I mean, the talk is called Teardrop Diplomacy, so the title of the book, Sri Lanka's Political Economic Crisis, so maybe a somewhat different take on the book or on the issue than is foregrounded in the book. But again, a very warm welcome. Please join me in welcoming Asantha into our midst. And with that, I'm just going to hand over. Are you wired up, or are you going to hold this?
I have this.
Okay. So over to you, Asantha. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kanti, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you so much for having me at the Lee Kuan Yew School. And thank you for your time and to come and listen to Sri Lanka. And the book basically captures the political economic dysfunctionality which happened recently, and the crisis in Sri Lanka. So it's a time frame between 2019 and 2023. So if you want to know a bit more about Sri Lanka's geopolitics and sort of foreign policy, what really happened, what is the connection to this book, like the previous years, what happened in Sri Lanka, I recommend you reading Conundrum of an Island, which is starts from 2015 to 2019, which is the Wickremesinghe and the Sirisena regime. If you want to know prior to that, which is 2015, prior to 2015, which is the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime, so I recommend you reading the Sri Lanka at Crossroads. So basically, there is a connection how sort of the political dynamics have evolved in Sri Lanka, and what happened in the crisis and what triggered the crisis. So all discussed in the book. So I will so straight away get into the presentation. So you can see the some of you must have seen these shots. What happened in Sri Lanka last year? It was the first sort of in the Sri Lankan political history where thousands of people walked in to the president's house and also president's office. They basically saw as a day that they won against this autocratic rule or the family rule, and they want to bring in sort of transparency. And so there was many slogans you would hear during this uprising. The picture on your right is the long queues that Sri Lankans suffered, basically for fuel, and many there were a few deaths at these queues. There were long power cuts as well as food crisis. So it triggered there were multiple economic issues that triggered the picture down. It basically at the bottom right is farmers where they protested on the fertilizer crisis, which was a huge crisis, with actually triggering all these issues. So the chapter basically I cover is I start from China in Sri Lanka, because that is the main discussion of the book. How much of China has got into this crisis, and is China the only the issue behind the crisis, and what is the role of China in this crisis? So it clearly tried to sort of describe the issues, what happened, the infrastructure projects that China was involved, the massive port project, the Colombo port city. I've interviewed the Chinese, basically the stakeholders of these projects, the managing directors. I've engaged in about 70 interviews in my field research in 2021. And so basically they're first-hand information that you'd see. And geopolitics is the next chapter, which is to understand what New Delhi thinks about the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka is a very important factor. What South India thinks about Sri Lanka, and China in northern part of Sri Lanka is really important. So all that is captured in the geopolitics basically chapter. Sri Lanka's foreign policy is discussed in the next chapter. Basically, how did we get into sort of having a non-aligned balanced foreign policy, and then we moved into a bandwagoning, I call it a bandwagoning foreign policy with China. How did that happen? The domestic political environment chapter discuss about the dysfunctionality of the government. How did that trigger? And basically, what were the political dynamics? We had the family rule of Rajapaksas, and what were the issues behind it? The corruption. There were many areas that I sort of highlight, and undercurrents basically. The security is the last chapter I sort of described on what's going on in the region, the Afghanistan issues. Is there any impact? The Easter Sunday terror attack, which killed 250 people in 2019. So what was the impact of that? And why did the Sri Lankans wanted a strong leader back then? So these are all discussed. The teardrop diplomacy is basically because of the shape of the island. Sri Lanka is called the teardrop of India, and that's basically. And but it is also a reference in diplomacy where you ask emotionally, for assistance. So that's also can be sort of seen as what's happening right now. So the timeline, like I said, the Rajapaksas 2005 to 10. I think that needs to be understood first, and then 10 to 15. That was the regime. of the Mahinda Rajapaksa. And then you had the defeat of the Rajapaksas in 2015. And it was a very slight margin where he lost 47.58. And the coalition government which came, the prime minister, the present president, who was the prime minister back then, formed this government. And then there was constitutional amendments, and there was a sort of a good start, but then it ended up after the Easter Sunday terror attack in 2019, it got into I would say a significant instability. The Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime basically comes into power with the pandemic time. Now, his presidency begins with external shocks. So where the tourism income significantly dropped in Sri Lanka, the remittances were really low. The tax cuts where he introduced had a sort of a serious impact to the revenues of the government. And the quick structural adjustment which he did to the constitution, which is the 20th Amendment, had serious impact to the, I would say, the overall, the institutions of the country, which is bringing power from the legislature to the executive. That was the adjustment he did. And the independence of the institutions such as the bribery commissions, the police commissions, so all that was taken into the executive branch. So all this happened very quickly within few months and during the pandemic time. And the China in Sri Lanka, basically, I begin with the work of Raja Mohan's, the reference to Samudra Manthan. Why is the literal so important in the in this equation of basically China, and what are they doing? So I actually go towards even comparing Sri Lanka with Solomon Islands. Now, this comparison basically captures what's happening China in Solomon Islands and China in Sri Lanka. Now, a few weeks ago, I'm based in Washington, D.C. now, and so I met a politician from Solomon Islands, Daniel Saudani. So I asked this question on what's going on in Solomon Islands. Can you explain about China factor? Now, what he said is that the China has taken over strategically the islands because of their engagement in the logging industry. Now, the logging industry I did capture in my book, but then what has happened to what Daniel shared with me, I have not written. So what has happened is that China has managed to get into the the logging industry, how the license are given by the politicians. So the politicians have been captured by the Chinese. So by political funding. So this is happening in Solomon Islands. And now Huawei has taken a 150 tower project in Solomon Islands. So what Daniel says is that they tried to warn at the beginning, but then there was no interest, but then it has already been sort of captured. And it is a strategic, I call it a strategic trap. Now, I don't subscribe to this Chinese invasion or what Washington speaks about. I mean, when I went there 2 years ago, it was like a Chinese invasion in Sri Lanka. I said, no, there is no invasion as such. I think it is overhyped. So then comes the debt trap, where I will come to that slide. Basically, because of the hybridity of these projects, that ports can be transformed into military bases, and so that's kind of, again, there is a bit of a overhype, I would say. So the strategic trap, which I discuss, basically, I capture this event of this spy ship, the Yangwang 5. Now, Yangwang 5 is a very interesting incident which happened, the spy ship which came to Hambantota, and where New Delhi said, don't invite this spy ship because there is a security concern. But Colombo couldn't turn it down. Then the last minute, Colombo had to sort of, give permission for the Yangwang 5 to dock in Hambantota port. So what really happened there? So I bring into sort of analysis of this situation. How come the China has so much of influence and significantly sort of, then when the ship came, you see the politicians going for the welcome ceremony also. So you see a significant, I would say, a kind of elite capture also, just like in Solomon Islands in Sri Lanka. But China has managed to sort of do this very successfully in Sri Lanka. And this is where the Dinesh Gunawardena is the former foreign minister. He says that, look, Hambantota is given 99 years, but, it could be extended further, he says. So it's actually something that China has sort of invested and significantly achieved, I would say, in the country. And the port city is another complete different sort of a chapter which I work on that, and trying to sort of analyze special economic zones where with extra jurisdictional powers, that how China comes in to countries. And there are many other special economic zones I bring into my analysis. Right now, even now, after about 4 or 5 years of developing this port city, there's not a single investor. So that's where another problem is, where are these investors, what China is promising. So even during the protests, what the people were saying was that we see empty lands. We don't see what's going on. Where is the development? Where is the investment? Where is the jobs? We have an empty airport in the Mattala, there's no flights coming in. Hambantota does not make the significant, basically the amount of revenue that is been expected, the Hambantota port. So all this is a question even to the protesters. When I interviewed the managing director of the Port City project, so this is a Chinese managing director, he says that, look, this is not a Chinese project. Who said it's a Chinese project? So I tell him, like, what do you mean? You can see the Chinese flags outside. It is a Chinese project. They said, no, it is not a Chinese project. So back to back, I have this interview, and he says, no, it's the Europeans who are coming here. It's the Americans who are coming here. It is an international project. Then I asked him, like, who are the Americans out there? I mean, can you list some companies? He said, no, they will come. They will come. So up to now the interview was in 2021, which I have captured in my book, but then now it's 23, so there's not a single investor. So the people's, the protesters questioning them, there is some legitimacy in that. I mean, there is, because there is nobody there. And then you have the tallest tower built called the Lotus Tower in Sri Lanka. The tallest tower in South Asia is in Sri Lanka. Then on the top of that, now I got into again, I interviewed them and sort of went to a sightseeing. And then on the top, you have VIP rooms, a revolving restaurant, but it's not functioning. So the people are saying, where is the revenue out of these projects? But the danger of the Lotus Tower is that New Delhi's sensitivity on the top antenna. Now on the antenna, on the top of the tower, was commissioned by the China. It was the Chinese military who installed the antenna. Now, one of our researchers actually went up there, got the drawings. We were talking when I was at the security think tank. So we wanted to know what is going on. So then I remember asking this from the military attaché in China, in the Sri Lankan embassy, the Chinese military attaché. He said that there's nothing to listen in India. So there's nothing much to listen in India. So their answers are very short. But there is a sensitivity because I think, Colombo every time gets into these projects and sort of does not think of the broader, the regional sensitivity or India's, I would say, the strategic autonomy. There is a problem there, so which has a huge impact. The strategic trap I have sort of formulated comes in three areas. Now the debt trap, basically, the debt trap, there is a debunk. A lot of people have debunked. There is, many papers have written on this debt trap. There is no debt trap. But Washington, the many think tanks say there is a debt trap. The reason is that there are loans like from Japan, which are sort of equal to China, about 10%. And then, so the argument is that then you have the private, basically loans also much higher. And then why would you call it a debt trap? So the question is that what I've done is I've listed those areas where people have debunked the debt trap and sort of gone one by one. For example, like military ships can't enter Hambantota, which is incorrect. Military ships can enter Hambantota, and Yangwang 5 did enter Hambantota. So some of them does not have a direct connection. So the strategic trap I came up with has sort of three areas. The political funding is number one, where China gets involved in political funding with the SLPP, Rajapaksa political party, and seminars, as well as altering the model. I saw that from 2019, where the democratic model has been altered towards, with the structural changes to the constitution, then you have 28 military appointments, etc. So that you have a more autocratic, I would say a semi-autocratic model, which supported by CCP. The next is the human rights, where China supports Sri Lanka's human rights issues in Geneva. And what I saw the difference, the Gotabaya regime, was that Gotabaya Rajapaksa, his foreign policy basically supporting Xinjiang, China in Xinjiang. So kind of a reciprocal arrangement at the human rights level. Then you have the military to military support. So those are the three areas which I saw like significantly coming in from 2019-20 and then growing. Huawei on surveillance projects and many others. So those things did have an impact because India was really concerned on those areas. These are the sort of the special economic zones that I've listed in my book, and not much of revenue in other countries too, in these economic zones. So the other chart is from aid data, where you could see how China has grown. And the next one is basically I've looked at the entire region, but I mapped this, for example, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, Myanmar. What is the Chinese loan percentage? So Pakistan, for example, it's greater than 20%. Bangladesh, more than 7%. And then you have Sri Lanka, it's more than 10%. Then what are these countries, how are the countries receiving Chinese policies? Are they okay with on the Chinese, basically on the Hong Kong national security law? Are they supporting that? Are they supporting the South China Sea? Are they supporting Huawei projects, Xinjiang? So if you look at this, most of these countries, they're fully supporting China. Either sort of, some of them abstain or be neutral in some cases, but then China has managed to win. And now this is China's soft power. You can see this is significant soft power of China. And also using the strategic dimension, I would say, that they have managed to capture these countries. So the geopolitics is another area which I discuss, which is a completely different chapter. So where I start the chapter from a Japanese attack to Sri Lanka in the Second World War. and where Winston Churchill says this was a decisive moment where the British forces managed to sort of push the Japanese away, because I think the geostrategic significance of the country, the Sri Lanka, has to be understood to understand the sort of the geopolitics, overall the geopolitics chapter. And I see a role where Singapore plays a role in the Quad, for example, the Quad military exercises, AUKUS, which will come up, as well as the Indo-Pacific economic framework. There is a role for Sri Lanka also. But the problem of Sri Lanka is that it's, the domestic issues such as, the foreign policy issues, the local political context is not basically, I would say, it has been completely dysfunctional, the domestic politics from 2020, 21. And right now you see some sort of stability with the Wickremesinghe regime. So all those factors I mentioned, that he's kind of quickly readjusting, rebalancing the India relationship, the Indo-Lanka relationship. You can see that Wickremesinghe has sort of, reached out. The projects that was basically, identified by Gotabaya Rajapaksa as national security threats, such as the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC grant, 480 million. We threw it away, saying it's a national security threat, that the US would come and, build a corridor, security corridor, which is all, this is the ultra-nationalist who was behind this Gotabaya's downfall, actually, making these stories up. And the East Container Terminal is the next example I bring in. So they were stopped. The Singapore Free Trade Agreement is another example in 2018, which was signed. The ultra-nationalists said, look, these guys, there is some invasion. There is economic, that Sri Lanka would not benefit so much from these agreements. So the ultra-nationalists was sort of, basically orchestrating all this, as well as capturing the policy of the government, and which was the downfall of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So the Gotabaya's loss of balance in his foreign policy, where I call it a bandwagoning foreign policy. The dangers now, some of the writings you can see from 2020, I have done sort of like a projection that this would happen. These things, the coming anarchy is one of the best examples. I wrote that 6 months ago. The anarchic situation, what happens when you intervene with the judiciary, when you intervene, he started even pardoning political prisoners who was criminals by using his political powers. He appointed 28 military 28 officers to the government bureaucracy for the first time in the Sri Lankan history. So there was a major general who was controlling potato, rice prices, and the bureaucrats, when I was interviewing the bureaucrats, they were very brave. They even, most of those interviews were on record. So they said, look, this is what's going to happen to the country. You can, because of the experience of these senior bureaucrats, they knew that this was military coming into these positions. We had the first foreign secretary who was a military officer. First, he mentioned that we have an India first foreign policy in his first interview. Then his second interview, he said, no, we have a Sri Lanka first foreign policy. So he didn't know what he was. So these are the dangers. They were playing with the policies of the government. So, and what you see was a complete dysfunctionality. And I had to draw this family tree because I remember Ravi was calling out, asking which Rajapaksa is it? Is it because you also will get confused because are you talking about the finance minister? Are you talking about the other brother or the son, or which one are you talking? So the journalists here also get confused. So I've done that. So now you have a family tree to understand what happened. Gotabaya, I think. So the problem was that even the phone conversations that he had with Xi Jinping, I've sort of captured that, where Gotabaya says to the Chinese president, saying that I'm ready to adopt a different model I mean, these are the dangers. I mean, this was published on our newspaper. The different model. I'm happy to adopt a new model. I don't believe in the existing model. So you can imagine the amount of pressure that India was taking during this time, and also many other countries. So this was a significant danger. The domestic political environment, which I've captured. So I looked at the structural changes, which is for 13 years we had 4 constitutional amendments, the 18th Amendment, the 19th, the 20th, and 21st. All these amendments basically taking the power away from the executive and bringing it to the parliament, and from parliament taking it back again to the executive. So back and forth, making the institutes independent one day, and the next day taking the powers away. So it was a very dangerous exercise. And the structural changes, I highlight it as number one, problem we had. The militarization is the second. The family rule is number 3. Interventions of judiciary, number 4. The media freedom, loss of human rights abuse. So all that has been sort of recorded in this book. And in the last one, the corruption. Now, corruption is the biggest issue which I captured. All of the, basically, the ones that I interviewed, the people who surrounded Gotabaya Rajapaksa's house. So during that time, so I did some interviews, and what they were saying, look, we are there for corruption. Everyone had this sort of on the corruption. They had a sort of understanding that there's high levels of corruption, and how come the people in the big office are never sort of being charged, and all these have been revealed in the newspapers and all that. So I would say that the reason the book was dedicated to these protesters, I mean, mothers were there, children were there, everybody was on the street. So I dedicated this book actually because they were very brave to walk into this, walk into the house as well as, all this, and ask for these reforms. So right now, Sri Lanka is going through political reform right now, which is very good. I mean, Wickremesinghe is trying to do this, and with the international community, IMF now. So I think definitely we see some sort of stability right now. Now, a lot of people say that this crisis was there before. This graph basically clearly says what happened to the debt of, basically the external debt stock of Sri Lanka. So from 2005, you can see the jump from 2005 to 15. That's Mahinda Rajapaksa's regime, where it has gone from 11 to 40 billion, the external debt stock. So this is where the problem is. And why did we borrow so much during this particular period? So the Rajapaksa at the beginning, and then continued by his brother. So the problem was there. They're correct. It has been there, but it sort of aggravated over time. The economic crisis had 2 areas, the liquidity issue as well as the insolvency issue. So I don't think for the last 20 or 30 years, there's not a single country that it's basically the foreign exchange reserves dropped to near zero. We waited till the last moment to go to IMF, but there were sound advice. There were many advice from international community, for Sri Lanka to, go and ask for assistance and, work on these areas. Why would you bring in, tax cuts and during a time like this? And there was many sort of discussions, but the government was not ready to welcome any of those basically measures. That was very. And what was the reason behind? Now I sort of let me go to that. So what was the reasons to ignore the early warnings? So why the early warnings? I mean, it came from Singapore, from many countries, experts from everywhere. So I said, but it is because of the ultranationalist viewpoint, the inward policies, the import subsidization, the heavy militarization, the democratic backsliding. I mean, the complete rejection of the early warning was because of this ultranationalist posture that the government had. And you can see the statements from central bank governor. I've clearly sort of quoted what he has said. So the country is right now facing this because of this, rejection of the early warnings. And the sudden rupture was because Sri Lanka was in a fragile state. It was not in a normal state. From 2019, the Easter Sunday bombing, it was fragile. So it moved into a crisis state. And it did have sort of a footprint of autocratic rule, corruption, and poverty. So with the Arab Spring, sort of, the three attributes, it did match some of them. But then it was quite different. It's not an Arab Spring moment, but it had some characteristics of it. And in conclusion, basically, Sri Lanka is at a tipping point where political reform is required, and Wickremesinghe is bringing that, which I'm very happy. Most of the reforms are now being sort of executed by him. And the economic recovery is happening now with the IMF. And there are still undercurrents like the new Anti-Terrorism Act, which is unnecessary. We have an Anti-Terrorism Act, and now we are trying to bring another act with more stringent measures. Now these, I would say, again, the ultranationalists are coming back. 2 weeks ago in Colombo, there was another book launch. Now, this is very interesting. A member of parliament has written this book. I'm yet to read the full script, but when he spoke on the national TV as well as his book launch, it's basically saying the crisis was, the people who are behind the crisis was India and the United States. So it was the Rajapaksas were removed by basically the Indians as well as the US. So here is the ultranationalists coming back again, and the elections in 24. So I can see another sort of strategic move from that particular camp. And how will the government punish is corrupt is a very important factor, because people are waiting for elections now. Now it's been delayed in Sri Lanka. That all that would sort of unfold in the next few months. So I think I will stop there. So I've taken a bit longer, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much. You're brilliantly on time. We have a good 35 minutes, which is our standard, and with such a rich kind of description and analysis of what's going on, I think it was a pleasure to hear that, get a sense of it. Let me open up the floor. We only have one house rule, which is please do just identify yourself. It's being recorded, and I think it's a courtesy to the speaker as well to know who he is responding to. There's a mic going around. Jesse will bring it round to you. So shall we have a first round of questions, please?
Hello, thank you. My name's David, and I'm here. I'm actually going to be writing an article about this event for the school website, Globalization. And I would like to just start with the last point of your conclusion, that you say this could be a lesson to many other developing nations. Are there any particular ones you have in mind and that are at a position where they could maybe learn that lesson? And do you think that they will? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's the question that most of even in Washington wanted to know. What's the next country? When the crisis did happen, one of the first things that we got in our think tank was that which one is the next country? We see a pattern in Pakistan clearly, because Pakistan has borrowed more than Sri Lanka. Again, returns, there is a huge issue. There is no returns, CPEC, all these projects. There was a joint paper which I wrote with another Pakistani scholar in Washington, CPEC, and comparing to some projects in Sri Lanka. Clearly, Pakistan comes into, and then Bangladesh is also there, but Bangladesh has a much stronger, I would say, economy. But Pakistan, I would say, and Maldives is also there, I would say. So it's not I mean, the elections are coming up, and but then the infrastructure, as well as the economic issues that Maldives is going through. So, yeah. So, thank you.
Okay. Anyone next? Otherwise, I have a question that I'll ask. But
thanks. Yeah, my name's Ollie. I'm at the consultancy PwC. I was interested in your comments about investment earlier on. I know you were talking about the port specifically, and just wanted to check why hasn't there been investment there? I don't know whether that's because there's no one has tried, maybe because it's intended more for military use or other things. But what's holding back? I mean, apart from all these general issues, what would it take to get more investment, and who should be looking at that?
Thank you. Another very good question. So the same question I asked from the Chinese side, why isn't the investors coming in? What they were saying was at that time, the government was slow in its giving its, extra jurisdictional rights and, the powers from the investment portfolio. Basically, they wanted to separate the zone, the port city, for example. They want to separate sort of jurisdictional right on. They don't want the investors to go through the Board of Investment of Sri Lanka, BOI. So they want them to come directly to the port city. So the Auditor General of Sri Lanka does not have any say what's going on in the BOI, the Special Economic Zone. So what I saw was it's more like the touch roads in Djibouti, the Special Economic Zones. It's the same model. So the Chinese would have to sort of work on to find the investors as well as in this particular model, because the way they have designed it is where the issue is. The Matala airport, there's no. We've been trying to find an operator, to run, but the issue here is that it's built closer to the bird sanctuary, a wildlife sanctuary. I mean, then there is environmental issues. So then I go back, tracing back so where is the EIAs? Has the environmental impact assessment been done properly? No. I mean, Auditor General has questioned, why are you building this airport? So that's been ignored. So the EIAs have been a serious issue. The Chinese have learned a lesson. I mean, it's a learning curve also. So now I see a lot of improvement in the Chinese side. Now, recently I have looked at, I did a project with the ASPI, the Asia Society, on, they're building a toolkit to improve the BRI projects. And I see they're looking at the EIAs properly, as well as, stakeholder engagement. So I think at the initial stage, they have missed quite a lot. And so I would say like they need to get all of that right. But some of the projects they can't because they already commenced and started, but then at the wrong place. That's with the airport. But the port, there is a question on hybridity again, because you have military vessels coming in, then there is no revenues. Are they looking at a forward logistics base? This is what Pentagon report says on Hambantota. So I think, it's fair to say that because there's nothing happening. There are many investors who went there to Sri Lanka, but then they didn't invest because of the political instability, I would say.
Hi, my name is Ron, and I'm from Mitsubishi Corporation. I have one question about the ultra-nationalists, the comeback of ultra-nationalists, which you mentioned about. So from your observation of the current government, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about whether or not the current government would be able to handle the situation?
Yeah, could I add a rider to that, because it's on my list, which is, could you share with us what's driving the ultra-nationalists? Because, I mean, an ultra-nationalist might be equally resentful of China. It's also a foreign country. Why just India and the US? So how is the ultra-nationalist motivation directed against India and the US in particular, but not China? So what is it related to the internal dynamics, the fallout of, the civil war and so on, China's role there in those days to support the then Sri Lankan government. Just give us a flavor of that, and then, of course, the lady's question.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the to answer Kanti, it's the civil war, how it ended. Mahinda Rajapaksa was the one who, ended the war, which is, he's regarded as the person who, with the assistance of China. So that's why China is seen as sort of, protecting, does not intervene with the sovereignty of the country. Seen as a development partner. China always says that they don't like the word even geopolitics. Any of my, when I go to China to many events, when I try to say geopolitics, they don't like that. Anything on the strategic space, on the geopolitics, they don't like it. They're there for development. They're there for economic development, So China has taken that position. And while they say that, there is a indirect reference to India. But India always intervenes in Sri Lanka. Now, India is also in a situation where India had to intervene at some certain points, even at this particular point when the democracy was losing in Sri Lanka. This was a serious issue where, military was coming in, where the civil-military balance was lost in the country, which I totally understand from the New Delhi's point of view. Now, again, devolution of power. Sri Lanka has its 13th Amendment, which has been discussed from 1988, never happened. The Tamilian grievances. So all these multiple data points have to be taken in. You can't sort of see it in one particular, viewpoint. The Jaishankar's last visit, if you take, what he says, main thing is about, this is Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister of Sri Lanka, of India, where he says that devolution is an area that you need to address. But why aren't you addressing? So the Wickremesinghe government has said, we will address that. We are bringing, so every government, subsequent government, has promised. Mahinda Rajapaksa said, I don't want to give you 13, I'll give you 13 plus. So which means, we don't know what 13 plus is, but then no one knows. But he actually convinced even in India that he was ready to implement, but he didn't implement. So the ultra-nationalist keeps the 13th, basically checked, does not want that to happen, sees as Indian invasion. So this particular book, that 2 weeks ago which came, I'm pretty much sure is on that particular line. But they're getting ready for election. That's the whole point. But the sad point is that we lose a lot of economic opportunity. The Singapore Free Trade Agreement is the best example. 2018 we signed as one of that's a huge opportunity for Sri Lanka as well as Singapore. But we can't do anything because of the parliament debate. You can listen to it, how it went completely to a very different narrative. So it can be easily propelled in Sri Lanka because of the polities. I would say the dynamics that's happening, like the Easter Sunday bombing, where security became the biggest issue in the country. And then you have a presidential race within about weeks' time saying that, okay, you don't have security, I'll give you security and, appoint me, I'm the military guy. That's what happened. Everybody voted. Then you have something else coming up, the whole dysfunctionality. So I think all that is the issue that the present government, to answer your question, Wickremesinghe, although he's the leader, he's the president, but he's appointed. He's not elected. So this is the first time we have a appointed president by the previous president. But he would have to be elected at one point. So that's one area. And the next is that the legislature is controlled by Rajapaksa's SLPP. The majority is Rajapaksa, so the ultra-nationalist narrative is still there. So it's kind of a hybrid sort of a model there itself, where the Wickremesinghe's political party had only one seat in the last election. he had only one political seat. And this is where the question comes again from the general public, like, how can a person who has one seat become the president of the country? So when I asked from a Cambridge lawyer, now, according to the the constitutional lawyers and the experts, it's correct. Anybody who has a seat in the parliament can become the president. So when I asked from the Cambridge judge, actually, he's what do you do in a situation like this? I mean, you follow the constitution, but you know it's wrong, obviously, because there's only one person who has one seat. And here's the thing, that what he said was that you'd have to look at it's something like the practice of it. It's not what is written, but then the practice, you need to get it. If the practice of it is also important. Just because you have one seat, you don't do that. So it's not in a sort of an ethical ground to do that. So like the 2 terms of the president, so where you limit yourself, the practice of it. Again, Mahinda Rajapaksa amended that. So the practice is important, but then it doesn't. There is a huge question there. So on the stability, even in the present government. So
thanks very much.
Touched about the military, the 28 big figures of the military and the government. It's not uncommon in some Asian countries to have visible military presence in government. I mean, if you look back at the Suharto years, many of the provincial governors were military people. And in a situation like Sri Lanka, where the politicians have proved so dysfunctional, you could possibly, excuse Gotabaya for trying out some other people, except maybe in specialist functions like finance and foreign affairs. But what would you say about the large size of the Sri Lankan military itself, compared with its security needs of today? Would you regard it as really bloated? I think you have about 200,000 people under arms, compared with, what is the population, 22 million or 26 million, something small. That's unusually large, and that's a very expensive thing for a nation like that. Could you give us your thoughts on that? And secondly, you might be aware that state elections are being held in Karnataka. They were held yesterday, right? And we're expecting the results in a couple of days, and the BJP is expected to lose power, which means that there'll be no southern Indian state under the BJP. Would that, how would a small country like Sri Lanka, next to southern India, look at developments like that in a bigger country? Does it have any salience for your foreign policy formulations, your strategic outlook? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ravi. 2 very important questions. I think the second question is where I begin the book, the Setu Samudram project, where the Tamil Nadu politicians asked for the project, and New Delhi sort of, denies it, the requests, always, keeping. Setu Samudram is a project, a canal project, which is across the Straits of Adam Pork Strait, between India and Sri Lanka, and it's a canal project. So that when you build that canal, it will bypass all the southern ports of Sri Lanka. So it's a shorter sort of a distance for the ships, beneficial, but then it's not beneficial for Sri Lanka, because that would have an impact with Colombo port as all that. So the South Indian politicians are asking for the project, where I quoted them, and New Delhi, they even go to New Delhi and ask, we need to. And one of the points that I pick up is that not only that, they even speak about Chinese influence in the north of Sri Lanka. So the South Indian politicians also talk about, has a concern about Chinese presence in the north of Sri Lanka. Now, this becomes really quite dangerous, actually, because now 2 days ago I wrote a piece for Swedish think tank ISDP. So, again, one of the rivers that is flowing to the west, northwest, the Malvatuoya, the Chinese are building a dam there and sort of moving, earth, and you can see the pictures and all that. So I kind of bring in, again, another sensitivity, because Chinese are now in the waterways now. So one of the main arteries, again, flowing to the north, kind of a warning again. All these projects, you need to look at the long-term perspective, and, they see the South India as well as New Delhi. That's my objective of this book, is actually to, point out, it's not just a project that they are going to do, but then it has an impact to South India as well as New Delhi. So the second question you raised is very important. The Karnataka, the election, every time there's elections, there's an impact to Colombo. Human rights issues, the Tamilian issues, the grievances are not addressed. From 2009 to now, reconciliation processes have been sort of derailed. Back to back, we had governments, many promises. I've interviewed the human rights activists as well as the civil society activists, how disappointed they have been. And so this is an issue that Tamil Nadu goes through, and then New Delhi have to deal. The large military is again connected to the second question you asked, the heavy militarization, the impact to the Tamilian community. That's a huge problem, that because demilitarization has never taken place, although it's been promised. You are right, absolutely right. You don't need such a large military now that the war is over. But because of the ultranationalists, Rajapaksas, and the moment you reduce it, they will come up with a very good political slogan to come back again, saying, look what they did to the country. But the issue we had the disruption was the Easter Sunday bombing, Ravi. That was something that, we all of a sudden we had like several bomb blasts. I mean, in several hotels, and 250 people died. And then we had a significant security issue. So in that case, what the military said was, look, they never gave us, they reduced our footprint. So Gotabaya had us as we had everything in order, but look what happened. So give it back, they got it back, then you have the whole thing, So your question basically is actually so addressing that. How do you demilitarize in a country where you have this, ultranationalist element so strong, and then you have the security instability also. I mean, with looking at Easter Sunday attacks, and so I hope I answered your question. So.
Okay.
Hi, Roger Johnston, Bengal Bay Capital. I've been in love with Sri Lanka for 30 years. I've been invested there for almost as long. My first investment, the currency was in the 40s. When we sold, it was 110. I've been to many Sri Lankan investment conferences, and the government is always about to get the place going. But there's a deficit, and it's going to be made up by foreign direct investment. But the foreign direct investment looks at the deficit and says, well, okay, when they sort that out, we'll invest. It went from 110 to, late hundreds. It stayed there for a long time. It's now collapsed. Well, got to 350. It's now 315. And I think as a very small representative of the foreign investment community, what I'm looking for is to see a change of attitude towards foreign balances. And we're sitting in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Government, and, he's quoted, although I've heard some Singaporeans tell me this is not true, but he's quoted in the 60s as saying he wanted Singapore to be more like Colombo. And he was the guy that said, if you don't mow the lawn on the way in from the airport, your foreign investor won't. If you can't look after your garden, how will you look after their money? So he had that attitude of knowing what the foreign investor needed and delivering it. But I don't see that in Sri Lanka. I can see Ranil is trying to do that, but let's assume that even if he runs, he doesn't get elected at the next election. What is it going to take for the people of Sri Lanka to vote for representatives that actually focus on getting the economy of the country going and balancing the books, so that it's at least a neutral investment opportunity? And I think once that happens, you get flooded with money. But whilst the deficit's there and there's no real attempt to balance the books, the money will sit on the sidelines. When will the voter make the right call?
Well, I think you summed up the whole the issues, that economic issues that what we are facing, as well as the what. I mean, to answer your question, Roger, is basically we have failed. I mean, you could see the subsequent governments, the policies they have taken, the weak institutions that the countries have, the SOEs. It's not as strong, transparent. There is a lot of issues. The new reforms that's taken place, the IMF, they are promising. So they would bring in some new sort of reforms to sort of how do we get this, the country in order. And we have gone to IMF 18 times. It's not the first time, but then we're not practiced sort of proper processes. We are not introduced the right sort of, we have huge losses in government institutes. So to win the investor confidence, you would have to sort of, have certain standards in place. I mean, you mentioned Lee Kuan Yew. So of course, he had that in mind. When he came to Colombo, he did mention that he wanted to make, back then, he wanted to make, Singapore like Sri Lanka. But a lot of Sri Lankans want, for Sri Lanka to become like Singapore. And, many years back. So why it didn't happen is also because of perception. The biggest issue, I think one of the issues we have is that Mahinda Rajapaksa, I can give you an example. I was on public TV and I remember quoting Lee Kuan Yew about his pragmatism in policy decisions he took. And then after the interview, I get a call from the president's office, on the secretaries. And he said, the president is not happy that you quoted Lee Kuan Yew. What are you even saying? The reason is that Mahinda does not like Lee Kuan Yew at all. And Lee Kuan Yew doesn't like Mahinda. I learned that after that. Then I quickly went to this book. It was an interview with Lee Kuan Yew, who has spoken about Mahinda, saying that a country would, with these ultra-nationalists, propagated by this Mahinda Rajapaksa, and it would never succeed. He was absolutely correct. Now, there you go, my presentation. So he saw it. And Mahinda only quotes Lord Buddha in his speeches, in his anything. He does not want to. I mean, this is the perspective. I mean that the rule had. When the ISIS had this book on diaspora, on encyclopedia on Sri Lankan diaspora, they had the launch in Sri Lanka. Mahinda refused to come there to the event. And I was the director of the foreign policy think tank, and so I was, what's going on? And said, no, I should do my book on the diaspora. And he won't come for an event because it's done by a Singaporean think tank. So they have that perspective. So it's a very strong perspective. It's quite difficult for us to, do that sort of that adjustment to that ultranationalist viewpoint, unfortunately. So this is where we have lost as a country quite a lot. Maybe we could do more with Singapore.
So my name is YC Wong. I'm a potential investor. Would you share with us how enthusiastic are the anti-corruption measures by the Sri Lankan authorities and the various groups. From my experience in the marine industry in Sri Lanka, the corruption is extremely deep-rooted. And from the streets of Colombo, I hear that basically many generals do not want to get out of the military because it's good business. So perhaps you could share with us what is the most pressing issue that needs to be addressed. From my layman perspective, I see that the most pressing issue will be that of corruption and that of the play of proxies and nominees, of keeping offshore banking accounts. So perhaps you could share with us your knowledge, your experience in such creative corporate games. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a very important question. Corruption is the biggest issue that, for all this what I mentioned, it's one of the strongest that I would say the variables that I captured during the research. One of the reasons that we can't address corruption is because of politicization of the... No, every time somebody does try to do the right thing, I'll give you an example. The Director General of the Bribery Commission, she started investigating on ministers, one of the strong, powerful ministers, exposed on the newspapers, everything. What he has done is he has given a port, one of the fisheries ports of Sri Lanka, to one of his friends, and then he has given it at a very, whatever rate that he has come up to his mind, which is a ridiculous rate, exposed by the newspapers, everything was done. And then she started talking about it. Few months after she was removed, Director General was removed. So you could see the politicization, political interference has crippled. So, you have the central bank bond scam. I have written a separate paper to Cambridge University on the financial crimes. If you're interested in this particular topic, there are 4 papers I have published on the Journal of Financial Crimes. One is on the central bank bond scam. Clear evidence is there, what really went wrong. Then what happened? So nobody is prosecuted. So that's why the people are angry. Where had the money been stolen? So there are many cases. There's not only one. There is so many cases that using their own powers to control media, companies, So corruption is one of the systemic issues that we have in the country, like you said, in many areas, and it has to be addressed. People want it to be addressed. So this election is going to be very tricky than the last ones, because this election has a different environment in Sri Lanka, which was created. People came up front, they walked into the president's house, which has never happened. This election is going to be quite tough. And that's why it's been delayed, but then it has to happen at some point. Corruption will be the main slogan, for sure.
So we have 5 minutes. I know Ravi has a question. I'm just going to give everyone else a chance. Otherwise, it's over to Ravi for the final question. Okay, this lady here. And then Ravi, why don't we take both together?
Thank you for the insight. I'm Winnie from Mitsubishi Corporation. So I would like to ask, because I don't really have a very insight of Sri Lanka, but given what's happening in Myanmar right now with all the coup and stuff, so do you think that there is a chance that such thing will happen in Sri Lanka in near future? Means someone with power, military power, will take over the whole country.
Dr. Asanga, I want to bring up this issue of Chinese soft power in Sri Lanka. I think Dr. Bajpai alluded to it earlier in this. Now, if you walk in the streets of Colombo today, you see more Chinese than any other nationality. You go to Sri Lankans at Katunayake Airport, there are shops that are calling out, making announcements in Chinese. You go to Mount Lavinia railway station, and the signboards also it was there for a while, Chinese. You go into the port city, and sometimes I think of your national languages, they skip Tamil once. Now, you said that about that ship visit, that everyone went aboard, but that I would assume is normal for any visiting ship of significance. The JS Kaga was there from Japan a few years back, and many people went on board, I'm sure. Now, how is it that elsewhere in Asia, when the Chinese are doing such a bad job of public diplomacy, they seem to be doing all right in Sri Lanka?
Myanmar parallel and a military coup and soft power public diplomacy.
I think the Myanmar parallel is, I would say, Sri Lanka is not yet there. So, it's been a bit over-exaggerated in places like in Washington, that there's invasion going on. There's no invasion, for sure. There is a strategic trap, yes, I can agree, on political funding and various others I've mentioned. But will it be taken over is the problem that, that Washington as well as many other think tanks has, that, would there be a capture? But there is a capture of elites, for sure. You could see China has not lost a single project in Sri Lanka. So there you go. So all my 3 books, if you read it, where you would wonder, like, what have they lost? They've not lost anything. That's because of the diplomacy, that they've been very efficient in their way of carrying diplomacy. The soft power, I can tell you, Ravi, you see, China has a significant investment in Sri Lanka in different areas. It's not, I think, you can't sort of generalize it with all the other. So we tend to generalize the BRI. What's happening here is happening in Kazakhstan, what's happening here. No, it's wrong. It's not. There is a special toolkit here. And for example, I can give you, Chinese embassy, the last conversation, I had on soft diplomacy is like, why isn't Sri Lankans watching Chinese movies or Chinese, why aren't they interested? So they asked me this question. I said, no, we tend to look at Hindi, and, because I said my mother likes watching Hindi movies, but not Chinese. And then he was saying, why not? So the Chinese, I said, why not? Chinese is really good movies. So there you go. And then the whole conversation was about that, about Chinese movies, promoting that. So I see a few months after how they are sort of, promoting it. They are really good at it. So going into the institutions as well as, so they're doing their work. They're doing it very hard, which, India is not doing their work. So I've had this conversation, this book launch yesterday in Delhi. Not much of work is being done. Dr. Jaishankar has been talking so much on these areas of that he has to, he has identified, but then there should be some work in the ground level where people are actually doing this soft diplomacy. So that's important. But this, going into the rivers, the dam projects, when you look at the entire, and how the Sri Lankans have sort of welcomed, you see some sort of Chinese projects, for example, like the highway project. You were in Colombo, you saw the highway project, and it's perfect, right? It's been and the first time we have a highway because of China. So, but there are issues on corruption, there are issues on various other stuff and subcontractors, why the local ministers gave, many, but they're not been investigated for different reasons. some of the projects that was stopped by Ranil Wickremesinghe, and he said that he will investigate the Chinese. So I wrote an article saying that the dragon cannot be investigated, so challenging the Prime Minister back then in 2016 when he stopped the projects. It's absolutely right. I was right in a few months' time, because he went to China and came back, and so he said the BRI is the best thing that happened to the country. So there you go. So I think the strength or the significance of China is in soft power diplomacy, in various other ways that they have approached, is quite strong. And they play a huge role when it comes for elections, when it comes for political funding, then it comes to the international arena on supporting is really important. Yep. Thank you.
So go back to this question by the lady. I think her question on Myanmar was, the military supposedly stepped in to deal with kind of chaos and a certain kind of politics they didn't like. So the question in Sri Lanka too is, in this chaotic situation, increasingly economically, geopolitically, politically, would the military intervene to bring stability? And on a slogan also of, we'll clean up the corruption, we'll bring stability, we'll hand back a good democracy at some point. That's always the kind of military excuse for intervening. So I think that's where she was going with that question.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for So that I think the military, we did see a pattern in 2019 and 2020 that the military was coming in to the forefront with Gotabaya Rajapaksa as well as the 28 appointments. So even a military rule could come in. So some of them were captured in our research as well as, this is a serious issue that it could become like Myanmar, but it didn't. You see the people's uprising and all that, and you coming back. Military did come forward, and then we have the new appointed leader. So I don't think that it would become, it will be if the military does come in, it would be a very different model to Myanmar or Pakistan. It would not be the same if it does come in. But I don't think the space is there, because still, we have that sort of balance. And military is quite disciplined in Sri Lanka, I think, to sort of, stay out of politics. There are several politicians who have gone into presidential candidates and, but then they have failed. They have not won the elections. So I don't think that would happen. So.
Can I just ask one quick last question on this? I know I'm testing everyone's patience and yours as well, but just on the military again, to what extent through the Civil War experience and then after that, have the Chinese penetrated the military, in the sense of links with the officers' corps? And likewise, to what extent have the ultra-nationalists penetrated into the military? Because that, if you have both together, it might be a very different military from the one you're projecting as a hesitant military.
No, I think... so both ways you would see that. The ultra-nationalists would talk about the sovereignty of the country and protecting, territorial, seeing the U.S. projects, like I said, as a national security threat, like a loan, seeing it as, then even the ports, seeing it as, port unions start talking geopolitics. Union leaders doesn't talk geopolitics. So for the first time, Sri Lankan Union at the port said, we are against this particular project of India because of geopolitics. This was like, I was wondering okay, union leaders talking geopolitics. However. So these are all, captured in the book. But I see, there is a strong pattern with China supporting. But I think... The model has been sort of what was supported, the autocratic model has been reset now. That's clear, because all the reforms that Wickremesinghe has taken right now, you can see, you're renegotiating back again the MCC, the East Container Terminal, the Japanese LRT, so all that. And keeping the military out, so 28 million, they are not there anymore. So you see a reset, a strong reset coming in. And with the Civil War, there was an opportunity for the military to come in. There was a military field marshal who contested the election, but he didn't make it. So I don't think the general public or the polity would see military as a solution, like in other countries, like in Pakistan, or they would fear, I would say.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sangha. That was fantastic. And thank you all for a lot of very penetrating and thoughtful questions. Do come again. There'll be events through the summer on various topics. The students have gone, some of the faculty are gone, but the school is very much open for these kinds of events. So look forward to seeing all of you there. And with that, just join me in thanking Sangha again for this fine session.